I don't see myself as a hero. I'm a guy that had this very lofty goal that came from humble beginnings and, had some pretty large mountains to climb.
But I feel very strongly that if you can dream it, you can do it.
Welcome to Your Space Journey, where we venture into the future of space exploration and the incredible leaders who are taking us there. Here's your host, Chuck Fields.
Hello, thanks for joining us today. Now, this is a very exciting time in American history for NASA astronauts. As a matter of fact, if you haven't heard, NASA is accepting applications for their astronaut candidate program until March 31st. So there's still just less than 2 weeks left to apply. Are you going to apply, or did you apply already? We'd sure love to hear about it. At any rate, we're excited for the future of space exploration. And to celebrate that, we're going to be showcasing my phone interview with NASA astronaut Scott Kelly later in this episode. But first, we want to air our segment called Your Space Journey. This is where we encourage you to call in and share what fascinates you about space exploration. For today's Space Journey, I am pleased to introduce Dr. Ken Kramer. He is a science and space journalist and also the managing editor and founder of spaceupclose.com.
I'm Dr. Ken Kramer, founder of Space Up Close, my own news website, and I've been a journalist for about 15 years. I was a research scientist for over 30 years, retired now. But I've been a lifelong space enthusiast since I was in second grade. I watched the Gemini and the Mercury flight, so I've had that bug since I was a kid, following space, became a scientist, and now I cover everything up close, right at the launch pad. I've been in the shuttles, been in the clean room with Curiosity rover and many other spacecraft, so it's real exciting to see everything up close. I organize a convention in New York City, the biggest astronomy convention in the United States, called NEAF, Northeast Astronomy Forum, April 4th and 5th. I help organize that, so that's real exciting if you can come to that. And I've got Thomas Zurbuchen coming from NASA, head of all NASA science. Yeah, a couple of things I'm looking forward to. Of course, the return to the moon. When I was a kid, we went to the moon. We haven't gone back in 50 years. So I'm very happy about Project Artemis. We've had a couple of false starts, as you and your listeners may know. Most recently, the Constellation program. This is definitely more real. Congress has to approve the funding, but I'm looking forward to seeing the first woman and the next man land on the moon. Maybe in 2024. If it's the next year, that's okay too. But the main thing is we have a real program. We've got the rocket, we got the Orion capsule, we need the lunar lander. So that's what I'm excited about. And then on to Mars. I'm very excited about the Mars rovers. We got another rover launching in July this year. I do a lot of outreach about Mars. I give a lot of lectures about Mars for anybody who's interested to invite me. And I create the Mars rover mosaics. So any of you familiar with Astronomy Picture of the Day, I've got 14 APODs, and I've created hundreds and hundreds of rover mosaics. So I'm really looking forward to going back to the moon, okay, and then going to Mars, because we want to find out if there's life there. That's why NASA's exploring the solar system, among other reasons. Is there life beyond Earth? So those are two of the big questions I'm really interested in.
Your Space Journey.
Thanks, Ken, for sharing your story. Again, we'd love to hear from you. Just call in at 317-862-4700 or email us at info@yourspacetourney.com. Just send us an audio or video clip telling us just what your passion for space is all about and what you're most excited about. We'd love to hear from you. Now on to our special guest. Again, NASA astronaut Scott Kelly. He's a veteran of 4 space flights. He commanded 3 expeditions to the International Space Station, and he spent 520 days living in space, including 340 consecutive days, the single longest mission by an American astronaut. However, recently, astronaut Christina Koch spent 328 days in space, just shy of Scott's record by 12 days. But Christina did set the record for the longest single spaceflight by a woman. Now, since Scott's return to Earth, he's released a memoir entitled Endurance, A Year in Space, A Lifetime of Discovery, and also Infinite Wonder, an astronaut's photographs from a year in space. I was fortunate to speak with Scott on the phone about his amazing experience and its inspiration for achieving goals that are quite literally out of this world. Here's Scott telling how his space journey began.
Well, I was this, kid that couldn't pay attention or do his homework basically my whole life. And, I think if I was in school today, I'd probably be, maybe diagnosed with ADD or ADHD. It seemed like it was impossible for me to pay attention. And I got to college my first year and I was struggling and just happened to one day go into the college bookstore, not to buy a book, to buy gum or something, snacks maybe, who knows. But, I saw this book on the shelf and, right in front, and I picked it up and I started, looking at the back, and I was interested enough in it. I took it home. It had a red, white, and blue cover and a really cool title, and I read it for the next few days. And the book was The Right Stuff by Tom Wolfe, and the way Tom, just maybe Tom's writing style, but also I think I was felt like I had some things in common with the guys in the book, like personality-wise, maybe, but certainly not work ethic or I should say the ability to be a good student and do well in school. And I felt like if I could change that one thing, maybe I could be a pilot in the Navy someday, which is something I never actually considered because I thought it was just beyond my abilities. And so that's what I did. I got inspiration from this book, and I taught myself basically through like some kind of brute force method how to study and pay attention. And eventually I did, started doing better. I changed colleges, changed majors, and then, wound up in the Navy and eventually had the opportunity to become a test pilot and then later an astronaut.
Now, can you imagine what it would be like to live, work, and sleep in space for nearly a year? Obviously, there were a lot of challenges to overcome. So I asked Scott what was the most difficult for him for being in space that long. Here's what he had to say.
The most difficult thing is, you're away from your family and you can't come home. And even in an emergency, emergency on the ground, so that kind of separation. You can't go outside. There's no sun, no wind, no rain, no nature. You're locked up. Even though it's an incredible place, it's a very rewarding experience, and but it's still, a challenge because the environment you're living in. The fact that everything floats is, on one hand, fun, but on the other, makes things more difficult to do. You got to be much more organized and careful about things and thoughtful about, where you're putting stuff, making sure something doesn't float away. You may never see it again. The space station is a very busy place. So that's, both the positives and the negatives, I guess.
Now, again, like many American astronauts for the past nearly 10 years, Scott had to train for this mission in Russia. So I asked him, what was it like to train in Russia? Here's what he had to say.
Different culture than in the U.S. I think it's one of the best parts of the space station program is that it's this international space station, so you get to experience people with different backgrounds, different experiences, different cultures, like I said. Not just in Russia, but all the international partners. The Russians do things differently than us. They, have to do a lot more with less money. So it's often that translates into being very, very practical in certain ways. They definitely have a much more academic approach to training than we do in the U.S., and I think that is just, part of their whole educational system. It seems to me like my understanding is, how we train for spaceflight is very, very similar to how kids, learn the Russian case system in the, first and second grade. Their method of, evaluation is very similar with oral exams. And it's an interesting experience.
Now, Scott had the unique opportunity of both piloting a space shuttle and flying on board a Russian Soyuz for this mission. So I asked him, which did he prefer? Here's what he had to say.
They're two completely different vehicles, very little in common, except for the fact that they, both launch people into space. The space shuttle is a very complex vehicle that could do many different missions, launching satellites into space, repairing satellites, putting a science laboratory in the back of the vehicle, robotics, spacewalks. Launched like a rocket with 7 million pounds of thrust, landed like a big giant glider. Whereas the Soyuz is designed strictly for putting 3 people into low Earth orbit. I mean, it can carry some cargo, but it can't do anything else. You're not doing a spacewalk from the Soyuz. You're not going up and repairing a satellite. You're not deploying a satellite. So, it's much less sophisticated, which in some ways is good because it's probably a little less risky, even though, the Russians had 2 fatal accidents in the Soyuz, just like we had, 2 fatal ones in the space shuttle. But, to ask which one I prefer, it depends on what I'm trying to do, actually, to be honest with you. If I was just going trying to get to the space station, I think the Soyuz would be the preference. If I was trying to do anything else, clearly the shuttle is much more capable. For me, it was much more fun to fly the space shuttle because I was the pilot and then the commander, and it was so technically complicated that, I think it's technically much more complicated than people generally could even imagine. The amount of effort it took to learn how to fly the space shuttle was pretty significant.
Now, one of the amazing parts about Scott's mission for being a year in space is that he has an identical twin brother who's also an astronaut named Mark Kelly. Now, what was unique about this is they got to compare the results after Scott being a year in space with his brother, Mark. And they actually found that there were some changes, but the DNA itself didn't change. What did change was the way that genes are turned on and off, something called the gene expression. So I asked Scott, this is before this study actually came out that revealed that, if he had any lingering effects from this mission in space. And here's what he had to say about that.
No, nothing physically that I can feel. So I would have to say no. Not like physical effects. Certainly, having that perspective and that experience, I think changes you, on a, emotional level, maybe. I think people that, have the privilege of looking out at the Earth and seeing how fragile the atmosphere is and how part of it is, polluted, but generally very beautiful, is, changes you for the better. I think it makes you want to, do whatever you can to take care of this planet for our, it's very important to our future. I think, and I think you also get a new sense of empathy where, you realize that we have this incredible planet to live on, yet there's constant, hardship and war and famine and conflict, and we should do a better job working together to solve those problems.
Now, when I had spoken to Scott, it was shortly after the very first Falcon Heavy was launched, where SpaceX launched the Tesla into space. So I asked Scott what he thought about that, as well as the future of space exploration. Here's him explaining that.
I think that was really a significant accomplishment. Having a company like SpaceX be able to build such a large rocket and then land 2 of the 3 first stages. Yeah, it's somewhat of a game changer for access to deep space. Now, I don't know. I'm not familiar with like the technical performance details between the Falcon 9 Heavy and what the SLS and that launch vehicle will have when it flies. I'm sure there are some differences that I'm not familiar with those, but still, it was an incredible accomplishment, and I thought it was cool that Elon put his car in there. I mean, it caught a lot of attention, much more. It got much more attention than if he would have put a hunk of, 2,000 pounds of concrete.
Your space journey.
Wow, I really enjoyed my conversation with Scott. Hope you did too. If you'd like to learn more about him or find out about his books, just go to his website at scottkelly.com. I want to thank Scott for taking time for a phone call with me. I want to thank you for taking time to join us today as well. If you like this topic, we'd sure love it if you'd ring that bell if you're watching on YouTube or on your favorite podcast application. If you can rate us and give us a comment, we would love that as well. We'd also appreciate it if you have a friend that you think would benefit from this episode. Just share this episode. We do appreciate that. Again, thanks for taking time to join us today. We'll see you next time. God bless.